Hi, this is Zach with Worn and Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the new Omega Seamaster Aqua Terra Railmaster, which I'll just call the Railmaster from here on out. This is a watch that was released at Baselworld 2017 that actually had a bit of a strange release because it was slightly overshadowed by the limited edition 60th anniversary Railmaster, which was essentially a recreation of the watch that was made in 1957, at least visually speaking. But alongside that, they came out with this new open edition Railmaster that is now starting to get a lot more attention because not only is it a cool evolution on the Railmaster watch family, but it's also the first time Omega has made a coaxial master chronometer watch come in at under $5,000, just under $5,000, but still under $5,000. So a little bit of a history on the Railmaster for those of you unaware. It was first released in 1957 as a watch that was anti-magnetic. So Rolex had the Milgauss, IWC had the Ingenieur, and Omega released the Railmaster. And obviously, as the name indicates, it was meant for railroad workers, engineers, technicians, but then also just people who spent time, working in magnetic fields. A lot of professions could, subject you to magnetic fields. And at the time, watches were extremely sensitive to magnetism. In fact, they still are, but there just wasn't really regular anti-magnetic kind of technology in the watches. So what they did was they added a soft iron cage in the watch, which protected it from 1,000 Gauss. And since then, that's been pretty much the standard for magnetic protection. You'll find that in many brands today, using that same technology that dates, in fact, actually back really to the early 20th century. Then the watch, though, didn't really do particularly well. It seems to have been discontinued in the early 60s, and Omega didn't bring it back until 2003 when they released a new version of the Railmaster that came in several different sizes and featured, at the time, their very new coaxial movements. And I'll get into coaxial later, but it's a brand new technology for the brand, and they want to show it off. And one of the places they did was in that Railmaster watch. So that watch, though, had no anti-magnetic properties to it at all. In fact, it had a display case back. So while it looked a lot like the original Railmaster in some ways, the dial was very similar, it kind of lost that core value of it. The watch went out of production around 2012, and since then there hasn't been a Railmaster. So this year they brought back the 60th anniversary edition, which is a limited edition, but then also this watch, which comes in a couple of different styles. And what's really cool about this watch is that it is a evolution on the concept. So while there's a lot of the flavor of the original Railmasters, it does not have, it's not a one-for-one, it's not a recreation, it's not like a throwback. There's a lot of new kind of styling to it, but it also features their caliber 8806 in-house movement, which has the coaxial escapement I mentioned before, but also is anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, which is way, way, way beyond what the original was. That's basically, you're not going to find any 15,000 Gauss fields in your daily life unless you do something particularly strange. So this is a really, really well-protected watch. And Omega's actually moving all of their watches towards that. But it works really well with the Railmaster concept because obviously it dates back to that original idea. So this watch comes in at $4,900 on strap or $5,100 on bracelet. And let's take a closer look. The case of the new Omega Railmaster is an update from the original. It's actually closer to what they did in 2003. And since it's part of the Aqua Terra line, it sticks with the case design from that family. But interestingly, it's actually a tiny bit smaller than what you'll find in the normal Aqua Terra line. So this has a 40 millimeter diameter. The other Aqua Terras are 41 currently. 46.6 millimeters lug to lug, and about 12.5 millimeters tall, and that's to the top of a domed sapphire crystal here. So because it's part of the Aqua Terra line, you'll see those kind of lines here visually. It has sort of a barrel shape with these beautiful twisting lugs, a nice thick bezel. 40 millimeters, I think, actually is a very nice size for this watch because there's a lot of kind of metal mass on this that makes it feel a little bit smaller. So it's condensed nicely, and that makes it wear very well. But also, as this is kind of a the vintage version of this would have been significantly smaller, so this is a nice update without being sort of a grotesque oversizing. One interesting thing about the Railmaster Aqua Terra, this version, is that it is entirely brushed as well. So the other Aqua Terras, usually this line here, this beveling, is polished, but here they went full brushing, which gives it a much more sort of a toolish sport watch appearance that I think is very appealing and speaks to this watch being a little bit less of kind of a glitzy luxury watch and more of a tool watch like its forefather back in the 1950s would have been. Looking at the case from the side, the finishing is really accentuated. Though a polished line on that bevel would have maybe made things, the geometry more pronounced, the brushing is exceptionally beautiful and well executed. So there's this really nice texture here on the side, a sort of a noise texture. It's not just straight lines from brushing. That just has a very high quality look to it. The line here is extremely sharp along that beveled edge. And then the bevel actually has brushing in a straight direction, so the light will play differently off those two surfaces, which is really appealing. The crown on the right side is kind of a funny design that doesn't seem to connect back to the historical model, but the new Aqua Terras also, I believe, have the same design. It flares out away from the case, so it gets a little bit wider as you go, and then has a rounded surface on the outside. There's then deep fluting along it to make it easy to grip. To be honest, it's not my favorite crown design I've seen. The tapering shape I can't help but kind of associate with sort of a kind of a muffin sort of a look, and it's a little bit less toolish than the rest of the case, but it's obviously very well executed, and I don't think it takes away from it too much. It's just a bit of a surprising shape, and I don't see exactly how it corresponds with the case itself. One of the more interesting features of the case is actually the case back. This has actually a couple of interesting things going on to it, but the most kind of apparent is obviously this really deep stamped piece of art that they have here. So you have this great texture, and then on it you have Railmaster, the hippocampus, and then an omega symbol. As I said, this is actually part of the Seamaster line, so that is where that comes from. The detailing here is just exquisite, and I really like, actually, the rest of the case is fairly straightforward. Not plain because it's an attractive case, but there's not a lot of ornamentation or flourishes or anything like that. So to flip it over and find this, I think, is really kind of fun, exciting, especially because that's for you, the owner. It's not outwardly facing. But then there's some other nice details about it. So you have some things etched in here: anti-magnetic, 15,000 Gauss, as we mentioned before, 150 meters, 500 feet. This is a 150-meter case, as the Aqua Terras are, so that's a very respectable amount of water resistance, especially for like an everyday sport watch. And then here you have something that says Naiad lock, and this is an interesting thing. I believe this is the first watch in Omega's collection to feature this. And what it is a system where the case back screws on, but is always in the same orientation at the end. I don't know the technical details on how that work. It could be some sort of kind of cam lock system, but either way, it results in you getting the Railmaster at the top, so you have that kind of same look before every time, which is just a cool detail, so you don't get it back from servicing and it's off on the side for some reason. I really love the look of the case back, but when thinking about it, I think there's sort of like this odd kind of conceptual issue with it here. And that's just because the original version of the Railmaster from 1957 had a solid case back, had a soft iron inner case. So, that totally made sense. Also, they didn't do display case backs back then. The model in 2003 then had a display case back, but didn't have any anti-magnetic properties. Now, the movement itself is totally anti-magnetic, so you can actually have a display case back and not lose any of the anti-magnetic properties. So in some sense, I feel like this should be a display case back to show off and stick with that kind of the fact that it's got all this great tech in it. That said, this is true to the original, and it's great looking. So, you can kind of pick and choose what you want, but, in the end, it's still a very attractive case back. The dial of the new Railmaster has some elements that have stayed true to the original from 1957, and then some elements that are completely different or have been styled differently, making this watch something between a throwback and a sort of a modern evolution. One of the most obvious features of this that actually I don't believe other Omegas in general have is this interesting vertically brushed dial. So there's two colors you can get the dial in. There's a steel gray, or here we have black. I wouldn't call this like a true black though. It's more of a faded black. And then it has this vertically brushed graining to it. And it's a very aggressive graining. So there's a lot of really nice visible striations. Some of them are deeper than others. They're at strange kind of random intervals. And that makes the dial really dynamic. So as you tilt it in the light, you get all sorts of different reflections. It changes as you go. It's just extremely appealing. The black then, as I said, it's this faded black. It's more of almost a graphite gray. And in some light, it's dark. In some light, it's almost bronzy. In some light, there's almost this subtle undertone of purple. But it just looks fantastic. You know, it's a really cool texture. And I think because the rest of this dial is actually very flat, especially for Omega, uses a lot of applied indices, that goes a long way to making it kind of keeping it visually intriguing. The original Railmasters, as well as the ones from 2003, would have had matte black dials. So that's also a nice update that dresses it up without making it kind of glitzy or feel like something it shouldn't be. So now looking at the indices, the primary indice here, which does stay true to the original, is this shark tooth indice of triangles. So you have stubbier triangles at 12, 3, 6, and 9, and then these long, thin triangles for the other hours. It's a great looking index. It's very distinctive. It's very bold. There's no, you see it on some other Omegas as well, the Seamaster 300. It's the kind of thing like, that's the aesthetic here, and that's what you're going to be drawn to. And it's just great looking. And here they actually did an interesting thing with the loom. So the loom is slightly recessed and then obviously filled in with this vintage style loom. And they use the term vintage. So it's not just khaki to be a color khaki. They did want to get a little bit of that vintage feel in there. And it's got a beautiful burnt khaki color to it. And when you get up really close, and this would be probably hard to see from the distance, there is some darker coloration within those marks, giving them almost this additional sense of aging. It looks really good, but once again, sort of like the case back, there's a bit of a conceptual question there. This is a modernized version of the watch. It's not a recreation of it. They had the 60th anniversary edition, which also has khaki loom. So I kind of wonder if they're, conceptually speaking, if like a white loom or more of the kind of pale green modern loom would have made more sense with this as a modern watch. That said, once again, it looks great, so I feel like it's a matter of them maybe having had the options for the really modern version versus the more vintage version. But as you can see here, the way the color works is, I think, very nice. The faded black dial with brushing plays well off of that khaki loom. I think it would have played nice off of white as well, but as is, it definitely works. Looking in now, you have printed numerals as well as some detailing in the center. So you have 12, 3, 6, 9. That is a detail taken from the original Railmaster, but they have changed the typeface quite dramatically. So it's a much more contemporary typeface. It's very graphic, very clean. The other model, the originals, had a much more kind of a Baroque typeface. It's a much wider. At first I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. It's a very strikingly different look, but I feel like as I've grown wearing it, it's grown on me quite a bit, and I think that that's one of the modern updates that works very well. Interestingly, that they kind of use something different here from the Seamaster 300, which they brought back a few years ago, which is closer to what was on the original. But yeah, I think it works. It has a nice kind of a crisp contemporary presence to it. Now, also looking in the center, you have Omega logo below 12, and then you have Railmaster in script in that contrasting khaki color there, which that looks great for sure. I like that that's a different color. And then Co-Axial master chronometer in very tiny, small caps. Sometimes too much text can be annoying. I feel like they did a good job of making that text very small, so it doesn't feel like too much to me. and it balances well with the Omega logo. Further kind of showing off that balance, and let me just move the minute hand here, you have the crosshairs in the center. That is a detail that's new to this version of the watch, and one that I think works really nicely. I'm a big fan of crosshair trigger on a dial. I think it uses up negative space well, does a good job of kind of visually creating symmetry. And here, they did a good job. So there's this long line between 3 and 9 and a shorter line between the Omega and that text. And that just really creates this sort of mirror image feel that I personally find very appealing. Lastly, you have a railroad track on the outer index, and that is different from the index that you would have found on the original, which was just lines. I think that might be a little bit of a sort of a play on the idea of this being the Railmaster, so you have that index. That's a little on the nose, so you can kind of take it or leave it, but I think it looks really nice, and I like how there's a line on the outside that kind of finishes the dial off visually, so there's an outline. And then I think it's cool how these triangles actually break through that. So the graphics don't end, the markers just kind of break through them, which is just a nice kind of visual contrast. Looking now at the hands, this is a big departure from what people might associate with the Railmasters, which would have had the broad arrow hands that Omega used on other watches as well. After doing a little bit of research, there appears some Railmasters that were made in the 57 to like 63 era that had baton hands like this, though it's definitely just not what's associated. But once again, it's a detail that at first I was like, oh, I love the broad arrow hands, but then the batons grew on me. They're much simpler, they're a little bit more common looking, but they're a lot less garish. And I feel like with the really bold triangles that are here, something that's a little bit more subtle in the center for the hands actually works well. So there's not just too much vying for your attention on the dial. They're still very legible and easy to read, which is most important. Then you also have a lollipop seconds hand, which just has a nice look to it. One thing that's worth noting is that the lume on the dial glows green and the lume on the hands glows a slightly more blue-green. So there's an interesting little contrast when the lights are off. On the wrist, the Railmaster just wears so well. 40 millimeters is like just a great size for a sport watch, and this one's fairly short lug to lug at 46.6 millimeters. So it wears very nicely on top of the wrist. It sits well on top of the wrist. I think it would for wrists smaller than mine as well, which is I have a 7-inch wrist. And just feels very sturdy. There's something, this Aqua Terra case design, like I said, it's very thick on the sides. There's a lot of metal around the dial, and that, kind of like a dive watch, which, makes sense given the lineage of the line, Seamaster Aqua Terra Railmaster, has this beefiness to it. So it feels like a sport watch. It feels kind of like a small dive watch without a bezel, and that has a really appealing quality to it. I mean, this thing it's sturdy in a great way, very rugged, and then it looks fantastic as well. And I mean, this watch, you can just kind of gaze at it endlessly because there's just such a wonderful mix of shapes and tones and textures that it just draws you in. And one of the things I really like about it is that despite the fact that it is, this is not an inexpensive watch by any means at $4,900 if you buy it on a strap, there's nothing here that screams like I'm a luxury watch. It's not. It doesn't have gold accents on it. It doesn't have extraneous polishing on it. It's a lot of brushing, a lot of matte colors, and a lot of just texture. And it feels like a sport watch, a tool watch, but one with a lot of style and one that draws on this kind of vintage concept, which I know I've sort of debated the concept of back and forth, but if you take it for just an aesthetic of just colors, there's this great warmth coming from the khaki-ness. There's a little bit of a warmth coming from the faded black. Then there's just all these great textures. I know I keep saying that, but that's one of the standout concepts of this watch. I mean, you get the brushing from the side, you get the vertical brushing on this beautiful contouring bezel, and then you get the twisted lugs It all just comes together to be an exceptional looking watch, one that's also very versatile. I think you could absolutely wear this with a blazer or a suit and have, a little bit of attitude kind of coming from your watch that might be unexpected. But then, I wore this watch with a t-shirt and shorts the other day, and it felt and looked great with that as well. Looking at the bracelet, so this one comes on a 20 millimeter bracelet here that tapers to 18 at the clasp. It's a fully brushed bracelet, and this is the more expensive option, but the other options would be a leather NATO or this kind of tweed herringbone strap that it comes with. I think for the little bit of extra money that it asks for, it probably makes sense to pick up the bracelet because it's easier to buy it initially than to get it after the fact. It's not like a crazy bracelet. There's nothing really that overly... there's not that much to say about it, honestly. It's a brushed surface. It's got a 3-link design. It's pleasantly proportioned for the watch. It's not too thick. It's not too thin. It's comfortable. Has a nice butterfly clasp here. So I like how clean that is underneath the wrist. That makes it, for me at least, I found more comfortable when I was wearing, especially if I was typing or doing anything like that. Sometimes, bracelet buckles, especially on sportier watches, can have a lot going on and they end up standing out quite a few millimeters, so you don't have any of that. Well, I will say, though, about having a bracelet on this watch is that I personally find end links on a twisted lug watch to kind of downplay how interesting that geometry is. So I did try this watch on some leather straps as well, and that really brought out the shape of the watch a little bit more. So I feel like I would like to have the bracelet to wear for certain occasions, but then having it on leather just kind of made the dial sing a little bit more, made the case geometry pop a bit more as well. While the exterior of the Omega Railmaster has a lot of style to it, where it's getting a lot of its modern credibility is actually from what's within. And there's a lot to talk about here, so I will suggest that you go and read the full review because I had wrote quite a lot about it in here. I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview. So inside of this watch is the caliber 8806. That's a 35 joule automatic bi-directional winding movement. It's an in-house Omega caliber, and it features their coaxial escapement, a silicone hairspring, free sprung balance, a 55-hour power reserve, and a frequency of 25,200 beats per hour. Now, what separates this movement from other movements that are out there are a couple of things. One, that it's coaxial, and the other, that it is rated as a master chronometer. So master chronometer is something that is new, that currently only Omega has reached the credential of. It was actually partially created by Omega. But before I even get to that, I want to talk quickly about the coaxial escapement. It's something you're going to hear about when you hear about modern Omega. So the coaxial escapement was invented by George Daniels some time ago, and it's considered to be this revolutionary development in watchmaking. Basically, all the watches that you have or have owned use the Swiss lever escapement, which was invented over 200 years ago by Thomas Mudge, and it's a design that obviously works well, but it has an issue of having increased friction, or not even increased friction, but having sliding friction just in the way it works. So friction means that it needs maintenance, it needs oil. So if you were to eliminate friction, you'd essentially increase the longevity of the watch, and it would have less service intervals, and it would also potentially be more accurate, and a lot of other things. And frankly, it gets very, very technical, and that's not my what I do. So George Daniels invented the coaxial escapement, and that is a different style of escapement. It works differently. It has direct impulse friction instead of sliding friction. So friction's been extremely reduced to even sometimes you say it's read that it has been eliminated from the escapement. So obviously that's better for the life of the watch, for the service intervals. It doesn't mean that a watch doesn't have to be serviced at all, but it does mean that there will, in theory, be less need for it. There's no need for lubrication within the escapement. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons about that. People kind of like to argue about it. It's that somebody who isn't trained in how to service a coaxial escapement will, not be able to do it, so you have to bring it back to Omega. But it's something that, Omega's obviously been pushing forward with. They first released them in 1999, and their plan is to, I believe, have all of their movements have coaxial escapements in them, except for the caliber 1861 that you'll find in the Speedmaster Professional, because that's supposed to stay within spec of what NASA originally, made it approved of it for the space travel. So that's the coaxial escapement. That's just a cool feature. Basically, it means your watch should hopefully work better, last longer. Now, the master chronometer is a newer feature, and that has to do with this 15,000 Gauss magnetic field protection that the movement has. So the movement has a silicone hairspring, but it's also made of a non-ferrous alloy that was specifically developed by Omega. So the movement itself is anti-magnetic. Now what they do is they take a already COSC chronometer rated movement and then put that through a series of additional tests that were created by Omega alongside of the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology, which is also referred to as METAS. And they're an independent body, so they actually do the testing, so it is independent, though they do it within Omega, which is all very complicated. And that test has 8 different basically processes it goes through, which include immersion in a 15,000 Gauss magnetic field that basically makes sure that the watch maintains its accuracy, maintains power reserve, and all these other things, which read about on the website as well as on Omega's website. And once that passes it, it gets labeled as a master chronometer. So obviously, this is something that, like I said, only Omega currently has, but it's a new standard for not just chronometer, but extremely highly anti-magnetic chronometer. And one of the things that's really cool about it, in my opinion, is that it doesn't just test the movement. It tests the movement when cased in a watch, which is something that I think people like to kind of point out about the COSC chronometer rating, is that that's all done in sort of this perfect setting before the movement actually gets cased into a watch. So what happens after it leaves the COSC, is up to the brand to kind of maintain that accuracy. Here it's tested in the watch, so it's suggesting that what comes to you is going to be still at that same standard. So, obviously in-house movement, silicone escapement, coaxial escapement, master chronometer, that all speaks to why this watch and Omega, watches are, they're luxury watches, what distinguishes them from other brands. And for the first time with this watch, you can get it at an MSRP for under $5,000. To wrap up, there's an awful lot to like about the Omega Seamaster Aqua Terra Railmaster. It's a visually very appealing watch. I think that's the best place to start, because if it wasn't appealing, none of this would matter. I think that Omega did a great job of bringing the concept of the 57 Omega Railmaster into modern day, 60 years later. And they did it at the right time to obviously use their highly anti-magnetic movements, 15,000 Gauss protected movements, which is way beyond what I think they ever could have dreamed of in 1957. So it really stays true to this concept. And of course, Omega's doing it throughout all their watches, so it's not exclusive to the Railmaster. But I like that with the Railmaster, they did a few things to make it fit kind of at the entry level for the brand, as for these coaxial master chronometers. So, in the Aqua Terra line, it's a couple $100 less than the other Aqua Terras. It doesn't have the applied indices, it doesn't have the polishing, but what it does have works really well for the concept. It is a tool watch. It is not a fancy watch. It is not meant to be a blingy, ostentatious watch. It was a watch that was meant to be worn by railway engineers and by scientists and by people immersing, themselves in electronic fields. These days, electronic fields are from your laptop and your cell phone and your speakers and things like that. So, it's less about being a scientist and more about wearing something that is, just protected in the everyday environment. And for an entry-level piece, I think this is really smart. There's a lot of really cool things happening in the $3,000 to $5,000 price range right now. More brands bringing in-house movements, and that extra bit of tech, really speaks to the value of this watch. So it's $4,900 now. Who knows if they're going to continue to kind of dip into that price range a little bit. And I think it's cool because not only is it competing in that 3 to 5 range, but it's also competing above it too. So, you know, I think that just makes this watch a very interesting watch. It's by no means inexpensive, but if you are in that price range and you want something that is visually very unique and, you know, packed full of wonderful movement that has some really cool tech in it, this is absolutely one to consider. Please read the full review on Worn and Wound. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thank you.